Chapter 6. Where's the vegetarian option? I think the vegetarian option is that you're supposed to scrape the gravy off and eat around the meat. Then what's the vegan option? The vegan option is to skip dinner. This short exchange was typical of the crew member banter I overheard as we all made our way slowly down the buffet tables. Dinner had been set up in a back service hallway just feet from the bustling kitchen. This evening's event was a large one, and it required a similarly sizable crew, a motley mix of techies all dressed in varying shades of black. They poked their way through the steam trays, comparing the sad chicken parts, rice, and wilted salads they were getting to the rich gourmet fare the attendees would receive in the ballroom. I picked gingerly at the offerings, not because I was worried about the quality, but more because I didn't want to put myself into a carb coma before that night's performance. That didn't stop me, however, from grabbing 2 desserts before I stepped away from the buffet and scanned the space for a place to sit. The hallway was littered with a long line of tattered tables and assorted mismatched chairs. Not seeing an obvious place to sit, I was about to head back to my green room with my plate when I noticed Joey D. waving at me from a table at the far end of the service corridor. I would have thought they'd give you a catered meal in your green room, I said as I settled into a chair next to him. I began to extricate my silverware from within its tightly wound napkin womb.
"Oh, they offered, but where's the fun in that?"
he said with a big grin as he sliced into a slab of mystery meat. He glanced down at my plate.
"You're having more than that paltry plateful, I hope. Or was this your second time through?"
I explained that I was about to head out to do walk-around magic for the cocktail crowd and didn't want to be loaded down with a big meal. Plus, I added, I don't generally eat much before a show.
"I learned early on to eat when the food is put in front of you, because if you didn't, you'd never get a second chance. Of course," he added, looking around the service corridor we were currently calling our dining room, "the surroundings weren't always as lush as this." As if on cue, one of the waiters dropped a tray of silver water pitchers on his way out of the kitchen, creating a sudden cacophony that echoed through the tiled corridor. "It may not be the Ritz," Joey continued with a grin, "but you gotta love it."
I smiled at his enthusiasm, amazed that after over 60 years in show business, he was still so obviously charmed by this demanding and often difficult industry. I'd run into many performers who didn't possess an iota of his zeal, and I realized as I considered this thought further, none of them had achieved even a tenth of his success. "You never get tired of this?" I asked, gesturing at the hallway and the buffet and our less-than-ideal dinner setting. Joey shook his head.
"I'm a road comic," he said,
his voice sounding more serious than I'd heard before.
"I live for 2 things, my family and my next gig, and I might add, not always in that order."
This last line was delivered with a comic inflection worthy of Groucho Marx. Before I could respond, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned to see the floor manager, Walter, standing behind me. His trusty agenda was in one hand, and he was checking his watch on the other wrist. "You wanted me to let you know when the cocktail crowd was massing?" he said, glancing down at our plates of food. "Doors are open and the bars are officially swarmed." "Thanks," I said, popping one of the 2 mini desserts I had grabbed into my mouth. I took the other one for the road as I stood up and looked down at Joey D. "I'm off to mingle in a maze," I said.
"Knock 'em dead,"
he said with a big grin, and then he looked up at Walter.
"You're running around too much. You should eat. Settle down for 5 seconds and have a bite. It will do you good."
Didn't look to me like sitting down for a meal had been Walter's plan, but he obediently followed the old man's instructions, setting his agenda on the table and heading over to the buffet line. My innate sense of direction didn't fail me as I snaked my way through the back service corridor, easily spotting the exit door that would deposit me a stone's throw from my green room. I hurried into my cavernous holding space and quickly filled my pockets with the cards, gaffs, and props I'd need to get myself through about an hour of walk-around magic. The hall outside my green room had been empty when I went in,
but things had changed in the short time I'd been gathering my props. I heard voices as I came through the door, and I glanced to my left. 2 doors down, I saw Leo Harper and his administrative assistant, Larkin, just about to enter Leo's corner green room. They were looking in my direction, and for an uncomfortable instant, I was sure Leo was addressing me. "Always good to see you," Leo was saying as I stepped into the hall. "Congratulations on the amount you raised this year. It was by all accounts a noble effort, even if it, sadly, fell far short of our own record-breaking contribution here at Harper." I didn't really understand what he was saying to me, but before I could assemble an answer to his non sequitur, a booming voice came from behind me. "Well, I think the difference is that our fundraising effort focused on contributions from all the team members, Leo, as opposed to a sad, lone, dare I say, desperate executive simply writing a check." I turned to discover Claude, the young man who had led the retinue of suits I'd seen at the sound check. But he wasn't the one who'd made the comment, as evidenced by the wide grin Claude was providing to the Bon Mot's author. Several other lackeys stood around, each also smiling at the speaker. Standing next to Claude was a man who looked like he'd been generated by a CEO R&D lab, and he was clearly their top-of-the-line model. He had chiseled features, piercing blue eyes, and the perfect sprinkle of salt in his full head of impeccably coiffed dark hair. His suit was finely tailored, yet he wore it with a casual air, a man completely comfortable in any social situation. He and Leo stared each other down for a long moment, each in front of their respective green room, before Larkin wisely stepped in. "You're late for a call, Leo," she said quickly, as she swung the door open and gestured into Leo's room. "Good to see you, Dave," Leo said as he disappeared into his holding space. "Always a pleasure, Leo," Dave smiled in return. He looked over to see that Claude had opened the door for him. Dave gave him a smile and a wink and stepped into his own room. He was quickly followed by his small entourage. For an awkward moment, it was just the 2 administrative assistants and me in the hall, although I might as well have been invisible for all the attention they paid me. Claude and Larkin spent what felt like an unnecessarily long moment staring at each other until she finally recognized that I was standing by my doorway, not sure of what was transpiring around me. "Claude," she finally said flatly, as if acknowledging him for the first time. "Larkin," he parroted back, and then, as if rehearsed, they each stepped into their separate rooms with their respective CEOs. I was once again alone in the hall. I watched as the doors slowly swung shut, and then I made my way toward the cocktail party, a rowdy spectacle which I could hear long before I could see. There is an art, I think, to approaching people at social situations with the offer of performing magic for them. When I first started to do restaurant work, I had simply approached tables after they'd placed their food order. Well, this usually gave me enough time to do a couple of tricks before their meals showed up. It was not an ideal situation because I was always going in cold. Sometimes people were delighted at the prospect. Just about as often, they looked around to see if the management was aware of my presence. In one instance, a guy was in the midst of proposing. Another time, a woman was raising the idea of divorce. You just never knew. It wasn't until I ended up as a customer at a restaurant that featured a magician that I learned the real secret of the trade. As we were seated, the waitress said, "So-and-so the magician is with us tonight. If you're interested, let me know, and I'll have her stop by your table." A promotional table tent next to the salt and pepper shakers reinforced this idea. From that moment on, I never approached a table without being invited. Sadly, that tactic doesn't really work in a cocktail party setting, so you're forced to be a bit more direct or obnoxious, depending on your persona. I struggled with this for years at corporate events until I stumbled upon a solution. As I had recognized earlier today with everyone referring to Dave and instantly understanding who they meant, I discovered the same phenomena is true in most corporate settings. Everyone knows the name of the big boss. So I learned as I approached a small group to interrupt them with something like, "Good evening," insert their boss's name here, "asked me to show you a couple of tricks tonight," and then launch into my routine. This setup ensured the immediate interest of the group. While they may not care about what I was doing, no one wanted to reject a direct order from the boss. I didn't think that technique would work tonight, as the event had no real boss figure to whom I could refer. However, once I walked into the cocktail area and saw the crowd, an idea hit me. The large room, which was adjacent to the ballroom, was illuminated with moody lighting in red, blue, and sickly green, which helped accentuate the look of many folks in the crowd. True to the name, the Zombie Ball, at least 70% of the attendees had decked themselves out in partial or full zombie regalia. I walked into a sea of torn tuxedos, stained and ripped prom dresses, and pale and bloody socialites milling around, chomping on hors d'oeuvres and sipping exotic cocktails. Some had opted for a simple pasty white look, while others had gone all out with professional makeup that would have looked at home on a George Romero movie set. Within this odd milieu, I hit upon a new opening line, which I tried out with success on a group of 4 standing near the door. "Excuse me," I said when I recognized a short pause in their conversation. "Can I show you something I saw right before I died?" This question seemed intriguing enough to capture their attention, so I launched into my first trick, where I turned 5 $1 bills into 5 $100 bills. As I had predicted, this crowd of high rollers was immediately captivated by the illusion and were happy for me to share a couple more tricks before I moved on to the next unsuspecting group. The next half hour sailed by like a mini version of the movie Groundhog Day. I approached group after group of zombies and partygoers, doing minor variations of the same 3 tricks with fairly consistent positive results. In those instances in which I felt particularly welcome, I also did a short encore of my new ambitious card routine, The Ambitious Dog, and discovered some lovely revelations in the process. When developing a new routine, which I do with far less frequency than I should, there is never a better way to improve the trick than to do it with a new audience as often as possible. That made this setting ideal, and I was able to throw in some quick improvements and variations after each demonstration. At this rate, I thought, the trick would be pretty solid by the end of the cocktail hour, or at least in far better shape than it had been before I started. The only truly odd interaction I experienced happened in the midst of doing my 3-fly coin routine for a mixed group of 30-somethings. Half were zombies, the other half dressed for a traditional high-end soiree. Just as I was reaching the climax of the trick, a guy stepped up to one of the audience members and tapped him on the shoulder. At first I thought the interloper was a waiter, as his outfit wasn't that dissimilar from what the waitstaff were wearing. But his attitude was nothing like that of a waiter at a fancy event. "Hey, Junior, we need to do some quick brainstorming," he said in a badly modulated whisper to a blandly handsome guy in front of me. "We got a slight change in plan." It was then I realized who the meddler was. It was the same fellow I'd seen interviewed by the TV crew when I'd come into the hotel earlier that afternoon. As I remembered, his name was Gage, and he'd said he was staging a protest against Finley Pharmaceuticals, or heading some sort of unfriendly stockholder takeover, or a little of both. "I'll be right back," the handsome young man said without conviction to his date. "Well, hurry back, Dave," she said with what sounded like a permanent whine in her voice. "We need to make sure we win a couple of those silent auction items before some creep comes in and outbids us." He nodded, a quick response to her, and just as he turned away, something about the look of his bright blue eyes sparked a recent memory. "Dave," I mumbled softly to myself. "Dave Jr.," I continued, adding in the nickname,
Gage had used. I looked over at the woman Dave Jr. had ditched to go chat with Gage. She was still looking irked at her date's disappearance. "Is that guy the son of Dave, the CEO of Finley?" I asked, extending the question to the small group in general. The look they all gave me was the visual equivalent of, "Duh." "Who else would it be?" she snapped, the whine of her voice easily cutting through the chatter in the room. "Now where's that other stupid coin? God, magic is so annoying," she added, looking at my hands accusingly. The trick, such as it was, did not end spectacularly, and I was happy to move on to another group of the undead and continue to ply my trade. Although that short encounter was decidedly odd, things really went off the rails at about the 45-minute mark. I just pulled out 2 rubber bands to begin my crazy man's handcuffs routine when I was suddenly aware that something very familiar was very nearby. The sensation was so strong that it made me stammer out the beginning of the trick as my mind tried to decode the sudden stimuli and put it into some sort of familiar context. And then I realized what it was. I was smelling my ex-wife's favorite perfume. It was the provocatively named Hypnotic Poison by Dior, and at the first whiff of the scent, I tumbled into a wormhole of memories, both pleasant and mostly less so. As I mechanically went through the steps of the crazy man's handcuffs routine for my small audience, I surreptitiously looked around, wondering who had the audacity and the income to wear such a memory-triggering scent in my presence. It was at that point that my senses were bombarded with a second too familiar element. It was her voice, which cut through the conversational buzz in the room, at least to my ears, like a baby's cry alerts its mother. The perfume and the voice combined to tell my brain the inevitable. Deirdre, my newly ex-wife, was not only in the room, but probably merely feet or even inches away. I panicked for a long, slow-motion moment, completely unsure of where I was in the routine, and not even sure I hadn't done this same trick for this same group seconds before. But with the help of muscle memory, I pressed on, stammering and stumbling through the effects so poorly that I'm sure I left the audience feeling as baffled and discombobulated as I did. I didn't conclude my performance as much as just wander away from the puzzled zombies, who immediately returned to their conversation as if I was simply a not particularly unforgettable memory. I backed toward a corner as I frantically scanned the faces in the crowded room. I had not seen or spoken to Deirdre since the day we signed the divorce papers, and from that point on had conned myself into believing we wouldn't ever need to be in the same room together. The Twin Cities were a big place, certainly large enough to provide separate sanctuary for each of us. We had no children, no pets or shared property, so I assumed we'd never have to come face to face ever again. Clearly, I'd been wrong, for somewhere in this dense crowd of the living dead was my ex-wife, a figure I currently found more unsettling than any zombie, real or imagined. While a zombie might eat my brain, my ex-wife had proven her ability to rip my heart out, which made her a far greater threat. Another quick scan of the room offered no further proof of her presence, and I felt all the muscles in my body begin to unclench, if only a little. Then everything reclenched in one swift motion as a too familiar voice came from beside me. "I thought that was you." The note of cheeriness in the voice provided me with a false hope that it wasn't Deirdre. But as I turned toward the sound, I recognized that the glass of wine in her hand, most likely her second, based on her atypical level of cheeriness, had given her otherwise dour personality a much-needed artificial boost. "So, you're working this shindig?" she continued as she glanced down at the rubber bands still hanging limply from my fingers.
How charitable of you. Getting your standard rate, I hope? Absolutely. As you so frequently reminded me, pro bono translates from the Latin as for the good and not just free, I stammered as I began to feel my jaw tighten. It had been a running argument, one of many in our marriage, that I shouldn't perform for free at charity events. Deirdre argued loudly and often at great length that these same charities were paying for the room, the liquor, the food, and the marketing, and that it wasn't unreasonable or uncharitable to pay the talent as well. Since her income as an assistant district attorney far exceeded my meager earnings as a mere magician, I felt I was never likely to be on the winning side of that argument. This was a familiar feeling I experienced in various forms throughout the 5 years of our union. I gave her a quick once-over. Deirdre had clearly chosen not to go down the zombie route for this event and was dressed in one of her many interchangeable smart outfits, this one a dark blue number that I vaguely remembered from past gala appearances. There was a long moment of awkward silence, as all we currently had in common was our shared history, and that wasn't likely to lead us down any friendly conversational paths. It was during this moment of quiet that I noticed a looming presence to my left, something large enough to be blocking a significant portion of the dim light which was attempting to provide illumination for the spooky room. I turned to see an imposing man, somewhere in his 30s, glowering down at me from his 6-foot-plus height. His head seemed too big and square for his bulky body, and he wore his dark gray suit like a steroid-infused tailor's dummy, patiently waiting its turn for alterations. Deirdre glanced from me to him and back to me. Although she always excelled in even the most awkward of social situations, this moment seemed to have flummoxed even her. "Eli," she said haltingly, "this is my husband." He put out a beefy hand. "Homicide Detective Fred Hutton," he said, his voice about as flat as the top of his head. I looked up at him, finally coming face to face, sort of, let's call it face to chest, with the guy for whom my wife had felt she needed to leave me and our marriage. Her new husband, which made me her old husband. The new model versus the outdated original. Husband 2.0, as it were. Homicide Detective Fred Hutton, I repeated, saying each word deliberately. "Eli's working the event," Deirdre said, still trying to find her conversational sea legs. She had some work to do, as she still sounded more than a little wobbly. "If you remember, he's a magician." "Hey, I thought Simon Hartwell was performing tonight," Homicide Detective Fred Hutton said, disappointment evident in his tone. He looked down at me. "Have you ever seen him? He's fantastic. He's half the reason we came. The other half was a free dinner." "Yes, I've seen him," I said flatly, "but he won't be joining us tonight." "That's too bad," Homicide Detective Fred Hutton said, his eyes moving from me to scan the rest of the room. "But speaking of dinner, I think they've opened the ballroom. Shall we find our table?" It had sounded like a question until the last word or so, and without looking back at me, he began to move, along with many others in the room, toward the open ballroom doors. Deirdre followed him, turning back to me. "Maybe we'll see you later," she said, although I don't think either of us was hoping for that. "Maybe we will," I said without conviction. I waited another long second and then added, "Nice to meet you, Homicide Detective Fred Hutton," but they had been swallowed up into the crowd. I stood there, frozen to the spot on the oddly patterned carpet for a long moment. And then a thought occurred to me. There are few things I will ever know with true certainty, but at that moment I knew, down to the depths of my soul, that any other time in the unfortunate future that he and I might cross paths, I would always address Deirdre's new husband exactly as he'd introduced himself to me, using all 4 words. Homicide Detective Fred Hutton.
I mumbled it one more time to myself. Homicide Detective Fred Hutton. And then turned and pushed my way against the surging horde of zombies who were shuffling dead-eyed and chic toward their numbered tables and plated entrees.